Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining. I think we're going to get started. My name is Tina Stacy, and I'm a Principal Research Associate at the Urban Institute. So as many of you know, neighborhoods in the U.S. offer drastically different access to jobs, amenities, and opportunities, which has lasting effects on intergenerational economic mobility for residents of low opportunity neighborhoods. To create opportunity and reverse these historic inequities, policymakers often utilize place-based economic development strategies to spur investment in low opportunity neighborhoods. Today, we're going to be talking about one such program, the New Markets Tax Credit Program, or New Markets for short. New Markets is a large, long-standing place-based program that provides federal tax credits to attract private investment into distressed communities. New Markets tax credits support a wide range of projects, including large commercial developments, office buildings, hotels, art centers, charter schools, clinics, small business expansions, and homes for sale. We're going to present today research that we've been working on for a few years to evaluate the New Markets Tax Credit Program. Our presentation will cover the history of funding for the program, how it works, what types of projects are funded by New Markets dollars, the characteristics of the neighborhoods that receive New Markets projects, the intermediaries who administer the funds, and the impacts of New Markets projects on neighborhoods and people. I want to thank our funder for this work, the Arnold Foundation. We're grateful to them and to all of our funders who make it possible for Urban to advance its mission. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterwards. All participants are muted, but you can send questions or comments in the Q&A at any time. We have closed captions turned on. If you'd like to adjust your settings, click the live transcription button at the bottom. And please tweet about this using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. I'm going to pass it now over to my colleague, Brett Theodos, to present our findings and then lead a panel discussion on the New Markets Tax Credit Program.
Thanks so much, Tina, and so good to be with you all today. Thanks to everybody who is joining. Brett Theodos, as Tina said, Senior Fellow and Director of Community Economic Development Hub at the Urban Institute. Special thanks to the top-notch team of researchers at Urban that partnered with me on this work. And as Tina said, thanks to Arnold Ventures for supporting this inquiry. I almost called this presentation the amuse-bouche examination of the New Markets Program. We put out 6 briefs today, so needless to say, there's a lot of content. And I'm going to try to walk through it quickly, but forgive me in advance because there's more in here than I can spend time on because we really want to get to the panel discussion. But if something piques your interest and you want some more in-depth treatment, I promise we've got briefs that have lots of detail. So we're gonna dig in. So first question, how has the program been funded over time? And the answer, it's done pretty well. It's not permanent, it's not indexed to inflation. But we've had approaching 100 billion in allocation authority approved. That's through 2025, so we've got a bit of an extension going right now. These numbers are indexed to inflation over time. So that's the blue line. It's kind of a confusing line because that is not actually the amount of investment that goes into communities, nor is that the amount that's not the cost to the federal treasury. So in that sense, it's to me not a very important or helpful line to focus on. Other lines that are important looks at, for example, the amount of estimated tax expenditures, and that's the cost to the federal treasury. And then here we have actual claims to the federal treasury. And we can also have numbers about actual investments. So that's what we'll turn to next. 55 billion in New Markets qualified investments into nonprofits and businesses. This is through 2017. An average of about 8.5 million. I'm not going to spend time through all the acronyms, but we've got more detail in the briefs. But this is the New Markets eligible portion there. And then we have a certain amount that's outside of that vehicle. These are not leveraged in the new markets leverage structure definition of that term. This is leveraged in outside funds that are being pulled in, total project costs. So some fluctuation year over year. There's stimulus that added money. As we saw, there's some map back to how this changes over time. Okay, next research topic. What types of projects receive New Markets funding? New Markets is a program that supports a diverse array of project activities, and CDEs, the intermediaries that get apply competitively for tax credits, have the ability to shape what those go for. So what have they been supporting? Manufacturing and food processing is the biggest use category, followed closely by retail, and then healthcare, and then schools and childcare, getting the biggest share of financing under this program. Whereas we saw on the other end, affordable residential is less widely used, and there's another category you can invest in other CDEs, forestry, etc. So we can also look at how highly leveraged these are. Again, not leveraged in the new market structure, but in terms of other capital being pulled in. We can see, forest, agriculture, mining, quarrying, energy, water, waste, sewage, office professional, those are drawing in lots of other funds. Whereas services, affordable housing, schools, those are depending much more on these tax credits. Okay. Third research brief looks at where do tax credit projects go geographically. So there's 74,000 odd census tracts in the US. More than half were ever eligible. That's not eligible at one time. Roughly about 43% of tracts are eligible at one time, but it is to say they were ever in the lifespan of the program have been eligible. And of those, there have been 5,700 odd New Markets projects that have located in 3,600 plus census tracts. So of the 38,000 that were eligible, 3,600 tracts have received a project investment. Most of that funding went to tracts that have had one or two projects that should read, but with a small share of tracts got appreciably more. So 44% of funding went to tracts that had only one project, a New Markets project, another 22% to tracts that had two, and so on. But a small number of tracts got a whole lot of investments. We look at that by state. So we see this is on a per capita eligible. So among the eligible places, the number of people, we look at how much capital is flowing in. And we see there that DC, Rhode Island, Louisiana, Maine, Wisconsin get the most total investment. Whereas Texas, Wyoming, Nevada, Guam, and Puerto Rico get the least. So there are some variations in terms of how much the capital is growing. And this in part reflects, this is not a block grant like CDBG or one of the others where there's a per capita share, LIHTC, where there's this, in essence, population-based metrics. This is a competitive application through these intermediaries that are proposing different coverage areas. We do find that large counties do the best at accessing per capita New Markets funding. So counties with populations above 300,000, that represents 54% of the eligible population, but 69% of projects and 67% of projects and 69% of QLICI investment, 71% of total project cost. So these are not, this next category, these are not rural places. These are smaller counties, though, 18% of population versus 12% of QLICI, and similar trends for the smaller counties as well. So there does seem to be something about being bigger to develop the capacities network, set of actors, influence, CRA regulated hotspots, all of it mixing together to influence where these funds go. Now, looking at a more neighborhood level, we see that new markets projects are more likely to locate in higher job, but in lower income census tracts. And this is comparing those places that have received new markets, the 3,600 odd tracts, against those that are ever eligible. That was the 38,000. So what we see here is not a real difference in population. It does appear that projects are going into communities with a higher share of the residents' population are of Black people. That's not the case for Hispanic, Latinx people. When we look at bachelor's degrees, interestingly, we don't see targeting there on that basis, and not much in terms of residents with jobs. It does appear that the communities that have received new markets are lower income at the median and higher poverty. They are lower home ownership, meaning higher rental communities. But a big difference, interestingly, is they have a lot more jobs. So lower income, higher poverty, somewhat higher share percent Black, but jobs. So they're in commercial sectors or other job centers in addition. And this is interesting. In contrast, we just had the JCT study come out, look at opportunity zones, and that's showing, for that incentive, that among the eligible, actually, where the funding is going is skews toward the more affluent places. For new markets, we find it skewing towards less affluent along some measures. Okay, so we do see, however, for new markets that there was initially a ramp up where the projects were locating in neighborhoods that had higher poverty, but that's plateaued. And in the past decade plus, the program has kind of stayed steady, high 20% poverty rate on average of where projects are going. And it's a pretty similar trend if we look at income levels in the neighborhood, a little bit bouncing around, but fairly steady over time. So we don't see this program getting appreciably more targeted, in other words, over time. Okay, next question, and I know this is one that is of interest right now in policy communities, is which community development entities receive new market tax credit funding. Unfortunately, we didn't have the data that is the application data, so we could compare people who applied against those who didn't, though I would point you to our previous report, our 2013 report, which is able to look at metrics of who applied and the attributes of those applied. What we did do, looking through calculating based on awards, is just look at institution types and who was getting access to those fundings. So first, starting with numbers, there have been 1,254 CDE allocations, representing 337 distinct or first time at some point CDEs, averaging $55 million each in allocation authority. And what types of institutions are getting those? Well, the biggest share, approaching 60%, are community development financial institutions, CDFIs, or other mission lenders. Then the next biggest share are for-profit financial firms like big banks. Then a share that over 10% goes to government or quasi-governmental agencies. These range from cities or counties that have set up CDEs or public housing authorities. And then there's for-profit non-financial. So a lot of these are real estate developers, but there are others as well in that category. And then last, nonprofits, but that are not financial in nature principally. Could be nonprofit developers or others organizations. And this just zeroes in on the share that is mission and that is real estate. Okay, so what we've seen is the CDFI and the mission role has had some modest growth over time, over the life of the program in terms of who's getting awards. And the government role, this gray, it's a little hard to see, but it has grown a bit, some fluctuation year over year. where there's been some shrinkage of role for these intermediaries of the for-profit financial and also the for-profit non-financial. They're mostly real estate developers. Okay, next we're going to turn to impacts on neighborhoods. So this is local level. We're looking at a lot of outcomes. Here we'll walk through those that are more economic in nature, and then we'll also talk about some that are more housing in nature. So what this looks at is first the effect on firms, jobs in the neighborhood. That means people who could be living wherever. Residents in the neighborhoods with jobs. That means people who live there, but they could be working wherever. Median income of those residents and poverty rates of those residents. So what we find is the estimated effect of one new markets project is the creation of 17 plus new firms, which is a lot. We find estimate of 100 new jobs in the neighborhood, 26 new residents with jobs, median income bump up of over $500 a year, and poverty rate of 2/3 of 1 percentage point. Now, a different way to look at that is not on the basis of a project, but on $1 million. So let's take for $1 million of investment, and that's what these numbers would be. So there's no way to randomize who gets new markets projects. That's probably good for the field, but bad for research. So one question that we have is how much of this is a selection effect? How much of this is the true impact? And there's some questions about that. So this is a figure that looks at business growth. And interestingly, what we see in the years before new markets projects, there actually is an increase in firm growth even before new markets. So it's quite possible that the new markets activity sustains or accelerates this, but it looks like there's also some amount of selection going on where projects are locating in communities that were already experiencing some growth. However, for jobs, it really does look like there's a bump up in the point where the new markets project is locating there, and that does sustain itself over time. Now, for residents with jobs, it looks like there may be some sort of increase before, but perhaps it accelerates after the new markets project. So we're left with a somewhat nuanced story, I think, where we find that there probably is an effect of new markets locally, where it is increasing firms and jobs and incomes and lowering poverty, but probably also some selection effect where it's locating in communities that are already experiencing that. Okay, and then we had the question of who is benefiting from these investments, and we can't answer that definitively through our research, unfortunately. We're working with snapshot data that don't follow individual people longitudinally over time, and as we all know, people come and they go through neighborhoods. But what we do see is some increase in population. So an increase of roughly 37 people and an increase in the number of people with a bachelor's degree of approaching 41. And this is an increase of a turnover rate of 0.4 percentage points. So what we do find there is there does seem to be some population growth. These numbers are sufficient to potentially explain the gain in income or the gain in residents with jobs. So it could be that these jobs are going to new people, or it could be existing people. That's something our data isn't conclusive about, but is, there's some suggestive evidence here. And this is too small to read, which is the worst line that any researcher says, but I really am not asking you to absorb the detail, as I'm just trying to whet your appetite for looking into the briefs. What we do is we look across each of the project types at these outcomes. The logic being that some project types are better positioned to achieve different outcomes. So I'm hoping to get you intrigued by looking further at and really supporting with an evidence base the discussion we're about to have, which will include, should we be prioritizing certain project types if we want to achieve certain outcomes? Okay, So the last research brief looks at local housing markets. We know that from a theoretical perspective, investments into a neighborhood should be capitalized in the home markets. And so this is in part of interest to see what's happening in those housing markets. And in part, it's the broader sense that is investment locally making a difference? So what we find is that the sales price within a mile is increasing with new markets projects being located. Number of mortgages, this is in a census tract, is going up, and those mortgage amounts. So we are again picking up an effect, and then we're also estimating that on $1 million basis. Again, there's some evidence of trends going up before the projects happen. So it's, again, probably likely that these projects are locating in places that are starting to grow. That doesn't necessarily mean they're gentrifying in any rapid appreciation sense, but they're experiencing some growth. But then that also is sustained or continued in part support through the New Markets project. And here's looking at new mortgages. Okay, so that was a whirlwind. The last thing I wanted to add is that, interestingly, we don't really see the effects start to decline over time of space. And so that has the implication of perhaps also meaning that there is a real selection issue here. So let me stop there, and we'll take down the slides, and we will begin to introduce our panel. So if we could get the panel to come online. By way of setup and introduction, New Markets is now 20 years old. I'm not sure how that happened, actually, but by way of metaphor, it's moved past infancy, probably even past its awkward adolescence. And at least in public policy terms, I think it's like squarely middle age. And it's managed to survive. It's managed to survive some handicaps. For example, having the worst set of acronyms for any public program, I think, that I've ever looked at, but more important ones than that. So building from the research that we've produced, I thought it was time to come together and reflect on the program to date, where it stands at present, where we should go from here. So this is a bit of a blue sky conversation where we'll be discussing not just small tweaks, but bigger questions about what we want from their program. This is our program, this is our taxpayer money, so what do we want it to be accomplishing? And we have with us the right folks to have that conversation, a compelling set of experts who have a diverse set of perspectives. So I'll just run down their names and then we'll jump into the discussion. And my hope is, audience, that we are going to be drawing in your questions as well. So put your questions in the Q&A and we're going to be filtering them and we will draw some of them into the discussion. So we have with us Annie Donovan. She is EVP and COO at LISC and is the former director of the CDFI fund, which oversees administration of this New Markets program. Meryl Hoopengardner is president of National Trust Community Investment Corp. Robert James II is president of Carver Development CDE. Inez Long is president and CEO of the Black Business Investment Fund, which is in Florida. And Laura Vowell is SVP at US Bank Corp CDC. So first off, thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate your willingness to contribute here. And I'll just let you mix in any personal reflections and experiences along the way. We won't do a big round the horn intro. Let's just jump right in. And the first thing that I would love your reflections on is the geographic targeting questions. Have we found the right balance, or can we do more? After the few years where we did the first few years of the program, we saw an increase and then really a plateau where we don't see the program continuing to reach deeper and deeper into lower income or higher poverty tracts. We also know this is a public-private partnership program. It depends on the private market. There are also people-based targeting issues where we might want to support nonprofits providing valuable human services or invest in businesses that may produce benefits that aren't really only tied to place. So panel, does New Markets look right, or do we need to do better? Annie, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, thank you, Brett. And thank you, Urban, and your team of researchers who did a really great job documenting this program and setting us up for some interesting questions to consider for the future. And also thank you to the Arnold Foundation for stepping in to fund it. I want to say, first of all, that I can hardly believe it's been 20 years either, because I've been around for all of it. But I think it's good to acknowledge just how much good this program has done in terms of where the investments have gone, what kind of leverage it's gotten, the acceptance in the marketplace. And there is a lot of good that has come from this program. So I think that the answer to your question is yes on both counts. I do think that the targeting could go deeper. And after 20 years of experience, I think that we've proven enough about the fundamentals of the program that it's time for us to try to go deeper. If you look at the targeting, the CDFI fund incentivizes deeper targeting through this criteria called severely distressed communities. And if you actually look at how many of those 38,000 census tracts are severely distressed per the definition, it's about 70%. So I think that means that there is room in this program to try for deeper targeting. I think that we shouldn't really take comfort in the fact that roughly 10% or less than 10% of the census tracts that are eligible actually get deals. And so I think that also suggests that there's a need for more diversity. And I think that the structural things that are built into the program are what is leading to the results that we're getting. So I think we ought to be looking at that structural level at this point to figure out how can we do better in the future.
Thanks. Others want to jump in with your thoughts about, have we hit the right balance? Should we do more?
I'll add one thought on the geographic targeting ability. You see this both in where the investments are made. And I know one of the questions was, is it true that some communities have gotten 30 investments and some have gotten 0? But the type of CDE who applies is relevant to this question too. NTCIC is a national CDE. And so we've got the choice of every single eligible census tract. And so we have to figure out for ourselves how to best prioritize different geographic places that we make investments. And the program allows for CDEs to choose their own adventure in many different respects. And we try to read the tea leaves a little bit for what we think the competitive application process is asking us to do. And we're also trying to do what is aligned with the mission we have as CDEs and the type of low-income community benefits we're trying to generate. So finding the right intersection of those things is different. What that intersection looks like is different for different CDEs in the program. And there are others who do this work who are city-based CDEs. So they're only ever going to make an investment in St. Louis or Cincinnati or Cleveland. And sometimes we co-invest with local CDEs, and there are a lot of powerful benefits that come from that. And sometimes we're investing in places where there is no local network of CDEs, and that's a different kind of investment decision about drawing national investment capital to those places. So I do think, as Annie said, the program design itself sometimes creates a structure where you can get disparate impacts, but in my experience in it, working for different CDEs and supporting different CDEs in my work, you see that in part by who's opting into the program and who's winning in which round, because it's so oversubscribed. You can get real differences from one round to the other, but most CDEs who are applying in the program should be winning a lot of allocation every single year, and how we all compete and raise the bar on ourselves and make room for others who haven't had the first mover advantage, I think is one of the things we're all trying to grapple with right now.
So Brett, on the thank you again for the opportunity. Thank you for inviting me to participate on this star-studded panel. I'm not sure what qualified me to be on this panel, but I'll chime in on the geographic targeting. Our CDE, as Meryl said, everybody's choosing their own kind of flavor of how they want to try to have impact. Our CDE is located in Savannah, Georgia. We're an affiliate of Carver State Bank, which is a 94-year-old Black-owned bank that's been, doing the work of CDFIs and CDEs long before there was such a definition, and serving, the least advantaged communities in our state. Our CDE strategy is one that approaches the entire state of Georgia. So we look at urban and rural projects and are grappling with, putting projects in the rural areas as well as the urban areas. One of the interesting things about this program is that we're in a small city, which makes us urban, but doing projects in small cities is very difficult. So and there's no preference in the program for targeting minor urban areas. We make a specific, we put specific priority on doing projects in minor urban areas because we know the need in the communities like Savannah or Columbus or Augusta. It's not just either Metro Atlanta, because I could get an allocation for the state of Georgia and I could do everything in Metro Atlanta. And that's not going to really move the needle in other parts of the state, where our state is probably, out of the 154 counties in Georgia, I think 113 or so of them are eligible as severely distressed. And so we want to try to spread the wealth around in the state as much as we can. But that in-between group, the minor urban areas aren't getting as much targeting, and that might be a policy solution that we can look at as an industry.
Thanks for lifting that up, and that does comport with what we saw as well. We're looking at county size. Just for the audience, will you build out one sentence more why you think that's the case? Is it that deal sizes are smaller and for given transaction costs it's hard? Is it market rents? What will bear? What is it that's harder about doing development in these, not mega places?
So that's a great question. It has to do with deal sizes being smaller. It has to do with market rents and property values not being as high, so that you can't support a project in the new market space needs to be $6 or $7 million before it starts to make economic sense, to pay all the lawyers. I'm a lawyer, to pay all the lawyers and to pay the accountants and to pay the consultants to put the deal together. And what's interesting is that, so in the rural areas, the deals that we tend to do are going to be big manufacturing deals. So it's going to be it's going to have scale. Once you find one in a rural area, it's going to have scale because it's big, and you're going to be putting in a plant of some kind that's going to develop and generate a bunch of jobs. In an urban area, it might be healthy food or healthcare or some of the other things that you can do with new markets. And because it's a large metropolitan area, the cost is just high. So it helps you get to that basis. In the smaller cities, it's hard to get to that cost threshold. And so that's some of the why.
That's great.
So Brett, I have a take on the geography. Again, I'd like to.
I'll just add quickly to that. Go ahead, Inez.
Thank you. Thank you. So first, I'd like to thank you for allowing me to participate today and all of the great work that you and your team are doing. And also, as Annie said, to the foundation that's sponsoring us. I think that the program overall has done great work over the years in regards to just changing the paradigm of so many communities, as well as participating CDEs. But I think in regards to geography, my take on it is that working in a state that is probably one of the states that tend to get the least amount of new market investments, I think that if there could be some sort of a tweak for states like that and CDEs that work in those states, I think that that could be an asset, because as a CDE that works primarily in the state of Florida, it would allow for me to create an ecosystem to support deeper dives of projects that are within my state. I'm not sure that a national CDE could see all of the things that maybe are really, really needed in a state. Not saying they can't participate with a CDE that is in that state, just saying that as a CDE that's based in a state, I think there's an opportunity, as Robert is sort of expressing, you kind of know sort of the landscape, you know the players, and you probably could put things together to be a bit more aggressive to try and help bring some of those dollars a little bit deeper into some of those census tracts. That's just my thought.
Great. Laura, you were coming in next.
So I have two thoughts, and I'll follow off of Inez's statement. It reminds me of a question. I don't know, there was a CDF5 fund kind of research effort probably now 7 or 8 years ago. And I remember sitting in a conversation and thinking, it would be great if the CDF5 fund, when they select to give an allocation, that they're able to predict where that allocation will go and then what outcomes would follow, right? So whether it's geographic, whether it's a specific type of project. So that's kind of going back to Inez's, obviously a Florida-based or Georgia-based allocatee with that state in mind. Like, do you get that same, do you have that same predictability with national CDEs? And how do you kind of trace through that predictability with national CDEs, or ones that have more broad kind of business plans? So that's one part of it. And then to follow on Robert's comments, something that was coming to mind for me is this concept that new markets is a relatively shallow subsidy. So it is not the subsidy that's going to make a project that would otherwise not be able to attract capital, whether it's debt, whether it's fundraising. It's not going to make those projects happen if they can't raise that 70 or 80% of the rest of the capital. So is that leading to some of the effects of, you kind of increased our level of the level of poverty within the census tracts where allocation was placed, but that kind of leveled off? And is there something there that we are not reaching the most deserving places? And so do you get there by targeting, kind of to Annie's point, those higher poverty areas, more those areas that have higher need? Or do you get there by increasing the efficiency or the value of the credit, and so making it a deeper subsidy? Like, is that another way to get there? Those are some of the thoughts that have come up for me on this topic.
Great. Let's go to our next question. This is exactly the conversation I want to be having. I think we can be quick with this one, but it is important. There's concern among some that place-based investments don't benefit incumbent residents, either because there's gentrification or displacement. I know that's been a criticism levied against opportunity zones, but even apart from that, people move through neighborhoods and they don't work in the neighborhood that they live in necessarily. How do you think of this as a place-based tool? It does other things. It funds human services, it funds businesses. Do you think it's effective at place-based development? Do you think that nothing's perfect, but this does enough of what we want it to? Or do you think we need changes to the structure to make it more embedded in some local change process that can really see it harness or reflect resident, voice or wishes or what have you? Big question. Any reflections there?
So yeah, Brett, it's a really big question. And I think that at one level, ideally, you would want to make sure that the residents of the communities are the recipients of the jobs, or the residents of the communities are the recipients of the services. But I think you run the risk of creating too many structures and strictures on the program and making it unusable. It's still a program that ultimately is rooted in attracting private capital to these communities. And private capital wants to be unrestricted, so there needs to be a very careful balance of how you restrict it. Now, I do think that the program inevitably can result in gentrification and doing some harm in communities. And I think we need to be conscious of and mitigate that. I think that CDEs are much more conscious of that than they have been perhaps in the early parts of the maturation of the program. But I would be careful about painting it with a too broad a brush and making it too restrictive.
I would add that, I think that's exactly the struggle with this program, Robert, is the give and take of the market, because we know that some structural biases are built into market mechanisms. And this program is to try to overcome them at the same time using them. So it's always a struggle in this program. But I do think, Brett, that your evidence, right, that came out in the study is not clear, right? It's not crystal clear about whether this is helping residents or not. And I think what we know anecdotally is, it's a pretty mixed bag. If you look from project to project, and if you think about the projects that we've all done, I think the ones that tend to have the greatest community impact are the ones that are done with community partners. And that's why the CDE matters, who the CDE is, what their vision is, who their partners on the ground are. Because if you're just dropping into a community, doing a deal, and you're gone, you're not going to have the same impact as if you're working with local community partners and who's doing job training, and you're linking your deal with another organization that's doing job training and so forth. So I think that those things do matter.
I'll also add we are a subsidiary of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So we use new markets exclusively to invest in historic revitalization projects. And this question's asked frequently in historic preservation circles too. How are you making sure, when you are taking the assets that are in a community and trying to revitalize them and keep the cultural and tangible heritage, and also ensure that it's still something important to the people who live and work there now? As Andy said, it is the work that the CDEs do in figuring out what the right investment strategy is and how we do it. The program is not an investment tax credit program the way solar and historic are, where you're just counting up how much the project costs and then figuring out what the investment's supposed to be. The CDE is making a determination about how much capital, how to help raise the capital, et cetera. And it's not necessarily sized exactly, in the same ratio for every investment that's made. So I think that's, part of the CDE's value add, theoretically, is the way the program's supposed to be administered and how we do that. And the kind of questions the CDFI fund asks in the application about community engagement and the additional private investment that comes into community are some of the questions that at least prompt the CDE to think through how they're addressing it in their administration of the program.
Great. Let's go next to project types. And thank you for those of you who have put questions in the chat. We're filtering those, and we'll draw as many in as we can. But project types, New Markets, we saw, supports a wide range of projects. Some are more logically able to produce certain outcomes. Certain outcomes may be more desirable than others, but obviously we could all disagree about what that ranking is. The flexibility of New Markets is a real strength of the program, but it also means it's harder to standardize, it's harder to underwrite, it's harder to securitize. You know, if every project is a one-off, we're left with higher transaction costs. But even beyond efficiency, you know, in terms of effects or outcomes on the communities, should we keep the program as it is, or should we do more to encourage certain uses? So another big question, another thing people won't agree on, but that's what the good discussion is for. Inez, let's start with your reflection there.
Well, I think that the program is a good program, but I think anything that's been around for 20 years, you learn a lot about how it works best, and maybe things that could be modified or edited slightly. So yes, I think that there are probably some things, some tweaks that could be made to the program. One of them that I would like to see is some consideration for some carve-outs for minority-led or Black-led CDEs, so that they can get into the game to do some of the new market investments.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that, Brett. And I think this is also getting into the next question about who the CDEs are that get selected. But as Annie knows extremely well, because I used to challenge her a lot on this when she was CDFI fund director, and but I wasn't just picking on her, because I used to challenge the director before her on this point pretty strenuously. But we did a lot of research. I'm you know, in addition to my work with Carver in Savannah, I'm now chairman of the board of the National Bankers Association, which is an association that speaks out on behalf of minority banks across the country. And, you know, we did some research, and we really used the 2008, 2009 GAO study that really looked at, you know, the issues of disparity among minority CDEs and participation in the program. And it was really interesting. Your study showed that over the history of this program, about 8% of the allocations go to first-time award winners. So if you're a first-time applicant, it's really hard to get into this program. But then the GAO study showed that if you're a minority CDE, you have less than 1/3 the chance of anyone else getting into the program. So if you're a first-time applicant and you happen to be minority, now your chances are less than 3%. If you were a Black-owned bank that was also a CDFI, the numbers went down under 1%. I was counting up before we started, and Carver applied for New Markets 12 times over the 20-year history of this program. And we've won twice. So you could argue that we just are the most stubborn applicant perhaps in the history of this program. There's a lot of reasons why we kept applying, but at the end of the day, it had to do with the deep impact that we can make with the allocation, and then with the resources we earn from the allocation. But I think that Inez is exactly right. I think we've got to have a real look at who the CDEs are and ways to expand the pool of CDEs that have an opportunity to participate in this program, because I think that will bring creativity, it will bring that focus on those specific communities of need that Annie talked about, and those relationships, the creativity to do certain things in communities that the big national CDEs may not do. And so I think it's really critically important that we focus on the identity of the CDE that wins the allocation and not just the project outcomes.
And I think it's interesting, Brett, that the answer to your question about asset types or types of projects that we should be investing in is so closely related to CDE type. Because I think, you know, Robert and Inez have hit on probably the biggest lever here really is because CDEs have so much room, you know, so as Meryl said, choose your own adventure. Once you get this thing, you have a lot of room. And so who gets it is really important and does get to what type of asset is invested in and what are the eventual impacts of that to the broader community.
Helpful. Meryl, Laura, either of you want to jump in on the intersection of how if we prioritize projects and or CDEs? And absolutely, these are interconnected.
You go, Laura.
So, yeah, so I'll say, I don't think we prioritize project types. I think the flexibility of the program and the broad ability to use the program is just, that's what I love about it. And I think you want to keep that because each community needs something different from another community. So that, from that perspective, I wouldn't touch it. But I think we're all saying through all of these conversations, whether it's a geographic, a project type, or what I think we'll talk a little bit more about as we go forward, who receives the benefit of not who receives the end benefit of a new markets investment, but also the benefit of participation in the program. So there's value in the participation in the program. And so looking at some of the stickiness of how important it is to have experience in a new markets program, and that leads to your ability to receive additional allocation and kind of that cycle continuing to go. Who are we leaving out, and what different solutions? Would they be more patient? Would they push the subsidy into places that need it more or have deeper needs? Those types of questions. And I think all of these are leading to that same thing, which is, what does a CDE do when they receive the allocation? How do they engage with the community? Are they there, or are they really committed to deep engagement and understanding? And then what do they do with the benefit that they receive from playing that role of deploying the allocation into the community?
And just quickly following up, and then Meryl will come to you. What do they do with the benefit they receive? What happens to the proceeds that are generated by CDEs, and how does that differ?
Do you want someone to answer that question too?
Yeah, you could take both.
I think that one's the hot potato that we might pass around a little bit, but and mostly I say that because I think, again, it falls in the choose your own adventure. CDEs are formed differently. They raise capital differently. They take different risks in the transactions associated with it, which can be everything from how they staff and underwrite their own transactions to what economic and compliance risk they take in transactions. So I think you get a difference in that answer in part as you look at those different ways of slicing and dicing what a CDE's role is. And we're not defined very easily. I mean, a question I asked you when I saw your data was, which category was our data in? We're a nonprofit controlled for-profit entity. So we could be in 3 of the 5 categories. And I know there are a lot of CDEs like ours that have a combination of mission related work, but you have to check a single box. So you kind of have the census data question of how many boxes do I get to check? But the other thing I would say is, and I recognize that what I'm about to say has been a reason that we haven't pursued change. And I think that's a problem. But one of the reasons that I think the program hasn't changed a lot in 20 years is because it is still an impermanent program. So it is really hard from a legislative perspective to say, please give me more, and this should be a permanent program. Oh, and by the way, here are the 5 things that I think need to be done differently. The legislative window doesn't always lend itself to making permanent and making changes at the same time. And so I think as people have approached that challenge over time, especially when we were getting 1-year extensions or retroactive extensions, makes it hard to participate in the program. And it creates a lot of these other glitchy things that exist, because I can't count as a CDE and no one else can count if they're a qualic-B in the program, that the allocation is going to be available when it's needed. And so the timing of it creates disparate outcomes from what we may all want. So I think we have to solve let's make the program permanent and make it bigger, and just the scale of it will help some of these things, but it'll also free up a lot of energy and smart people to be working on some of the things that we can do to improve it at the same time.
And that's a really excellent point. The other thing about the politics of the program is that, you know, part of what went into, and I was around for those very early days when the program was being shaped, and it was shaped by the Clinton administration as a program that they wanted to be big. They wanted it to be bigger than the community investment ecosystem. And at the time, $15 billion was a lot of money. And so it was conceived as anybody can be a CDE, including big money center banks. And, you know, when you ask the question about, so what happens, you know, with the proceeds, nobody was really thinking about that. The political calculation then was, how do we get this through Congress? And the political calculation still is now. You know, Laura is here. She's from one of those big money center banks. And so, you know, that, you know, they have a loud voice. And so that's another dimension to it at this point. So the politics can get very tricky, but I think Meryl's point is very well taken, that it's not a permanent program. It's hard to make changes.
And yeah, Brett, I think the question of what happens to the resources is really, really critical. So the way that I like to think about this is, you know, the program statutorily is Congress authorized the Treasury to run a competition for these allocations of the new markets tax credits, and they left a pretty wide berth for Treasury to decide how to run the competition. But one thing that they did say in the statute is that you're supposed to compete based on impact. And so the program counts certain impacts. My challenge to the program is, you know, they count jobs, they count, you know, they count certain things. No one counts what happens to the money that you earn from deploying the credits. And so I think that needs to be a part of the impact calculation. And I think that if you did that, you know, BBIF would score higher, because, you know, Inez is going to take the profit that she earns from deploying the new markets tax credits, and then she's going to plow that back into her organization, which already does deep impact small business lending to Black and brown people in the state of Florida, where they have a hard time accessing credit. If you put that money into Carver State Bank, I'm going to take that and I'm going to be able to leverage it up 10 times and make more loans for affordable housing and small businesses, where 90% of my lending is going into Black communities. So there's no one asking those questions about the impact that happens after the project. And I think that that's really, really critical for us to do, because we don't chase project types, as Laura said, but we do chase impacts. And so I think if we broaden the definition of impact, you'd get a better result in terms of the CDEs that are winning these awards.
I'll pull Robert's thread one more notch to say, I'm not actually sure we know what the CDFI fund values in the impacts. We know what questions get asked in the application, and we know the data that we're required to track, but we don't actually know even winning CDEs. We've won 683 million, and I can't tell you how the CDFI fund scores the jobs we created versus the community impacts generated by the community facility transactions, because we never see a score sheet. None of us ever, if you win or lose, you never see a score sheet. And so we don't know what good impact means. And I think that's one of the opportunities in the program too, to encourage more transparency, to actually see how we're all being evaluated, and with all the diversity of asset classes and geography and what is and what isn't in the program in those ways already, how do they compare apples and oranges and watermelons? Because I'm not even sure they think we're all in the same fruit basket. So it's really, I think to solve your problem, we even have to start with, how do they even score what they're already asking for?
Great. Let's round out. We're going to come to a close here in a couple more minutes, get people out on time, but we want to draw in a couple Q&As that we'll mix together, and a couple of reflections in terms of what needs to change or what can change. I heard lifted up permanent authorization. I also know folks in the industry would like it indexed to inflation. I heard a desire for bigger, though I'm curious about how much bigger you think it should be. But what other changes? There's questions about compliance costs. I know there's other discussions about other reforms. What would you say when congressional staffer X calls and says, we might have a window, what is it that we should do about new markets? Or Deputy Assistant Secretary calls and say, hey, I'm open to trying something different.
I mean, I'll start just by saying, I think the biggest thing that we should focus on going forward is how to get at structural racism in the program. One of the things that that Robert doesn't know is I actually enjoyed those exchanges with him, and I learned a lot from them. And as I looked more deeply into the program, based on the kinds of input from him, I was able to see the ways in which the structural racism that is built into our finance system is reflected in the New Markets program. And those are deep structural problems. And I think we have to prioritize getting at those, because I think that's connected to getting to deeper impact.
Annie, I knew
If
you
I may follow.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, Robert.
In all those conversations, Annie. Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's several fixes we could make. There's several practical things we could do. One is, you know, and Annie knows I've always said this, all it says is it has to be a competition. It doesn't say that BBIF has to be competing against US Bank. It just says it has to be a competition. So one way of addressing some of this is you could create some categories and have people compete against institutions that are like them. You know, that I think would get some more equity in the program. I think you could have a situation where you carve out a certain amount of the allocation each year for new entrants, so that people could get an opportunity to actually get that first allocation. I think that we could also emphasize allowing those deep impact institutions like a BBIF or a Carver that are focusing in on those states to have a little bit more patience with their qualities, so that you have more time to work a project. Because right now what the program does is it really emphasizes speed. And so you're under some pressure to get your allocation out so that you can be more successful on your next round application. And so you're focusing in on those deals that are shovel ready. And it doesn't give you as much, because as Meryl said, you can't predict from one year to another whether you're going to win. It puts pressure on you to not work with those communities that really need you to guide them on how to put the project together. And if you had a little bit more time with some of your allocation, I think that those would be very impactful and get you, you know, no pun intended, deeper impact.
I'll add to the conversation about increasing representation of minority-led CDEs to include kind of grassroots efforts by current industry participants. So this is something we're focused on, helping organizations build a track record, helping organizations get experience with the New Markets program, those types of things, I think, and also working with the CDFI Fund to ensure that when they write questions and they offer suggestions, or I guess I'll consider questions in the application, kind of lead to suggestions of behavior, right? And so making sure that those questions and the scoring process are incentivizing the right types of behavior. And so using an intermediate CDE structure to allow an organization that doesn't have a strong and long and deep track record in this specific tool to gain that track record, or working with the CDFI Fund to ensure we're defining what track record means. It doesn't have to be new markets, lending, or investing. It can be some other type of subsidy that should be relevant and workable. But I do think, I'll just say quickly, and I saw this as one of the questions, I think we've answered it, you know, to address the underrepresentation of person of color-led CDEs in the industry. I think we attack it from the advocacy legislative level, so asking for set-asides and definitions at the statute and legislative level, asking the CDFI Fund to consider the administration of the program and the application process, and where systemic biases can be built into that process. And then as an industry itself, doing better and having kind of feeling a goal, you know, a common goal to improve, and using particularly this tool as one to show how we can work to make changes to kind of change the direction of the path.
I would agree with what's been said. If we're going to pursue one legislative change, I think we ought to tackle the one that is hard and persistent. And as Annie said, deal with the structural racism that is in the program and is the reason why, in many ways, the program exists, to try to tackle the inequities that already exist in our communities. So I would say from a legislative perspective, like full stop, don't try to do the easier thing, do the hard thing that's most important. If we're also going to tackle regulatory issues, though, there's stuff that we could fix with the IRS, and how the leverage structure works in new markets makes it more challenging to do real operating business investing than it does to do real estate. The operating income rule makes it really hard to do real equity quilicky investments. So again, things that are built into the structure of the program are creating a natural bias, which may not have been intended in the program design, but it's the way people live and breathe in it. So if you want people to take more risk in certain areas, then de-risk it in others to make it more achievable.
And just quickly on that, Meryl, I know history has its own inertia, but do you see good reasons in contemporary moments why some of those rules are still in place? Or no, it's just a matter of making some changes?
There are probably good reasons around what is now the history people have and the experience people have in the program itself creates its own inertia. And I know how to tackle it, and there's a workaround to it. And so I think there's some reluctance to change it if you think you've figured it out already, even if it's the least efficient approach. But I can't think of a strong policy reason not to rethink how capital is raised in the program and how capital is invested, to level the playing field between debt and equity and real estate and non-real estate investments. I don't think the way the rule works now is creating a benefit. I think it's just creating unintended negative consequences.
Good. Okay. Any last words? Any other burning suggestions to throw on here?
Well, there was a question in the chat about whether or not we're bullish about the program. And I want to say I am bullish about the program. I think, you know, and there's a reason to be. We just got another 5-year allocation and an increase to $5 billion per year. And that's a really big deal. That's a huge accomplishment and a reason to be confident, and all the more reason for us to lean into making this program better for the next 20 years. Like, let's try to get deeper. Let's make the impact better. So yeah, I remain entirely bullish.
Awesome. Other last words? Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Really appreciate the discussion. Robert, were you coming in for a last word? No? Okay. Thanks so much. Thanks again to the team to put this together, including our communications folks and to Arnold Ventures for funding it. Thank you. Special thanks to all of our panelists. This was a terrific discussion. I would love to do this every month and keep digging into this. This is really important stuff. So be well, keep up the good work. Thanks.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Brett.
You.